Welcome to the Power of Purity podcast, the show that empowers men to experience their sexual gift in a healthier way. Now here's your host, Tony Ingracia.
Hey guys, what up? I'm glad you're back with me on the Power of Purity podcast. Thanks for tuning in to this episode, and I'm very excited about this current series that we've started entitled Understanding Your Story. I think it's incredibly important, and we're learning that if our life is going to be healed by God, it has something to do with letting God into the stories of our life so God can bring His healing into our stories. He can bring His light into the darkest places of our stories. He can bring His truth into our stories where lies became attached to our soul. He can bring His peace into our stories where torment became attached to us. You see, He can bring His freedom into our stories where captivity became attached to us. So, becoming a healthier person and experiencing God's healing and redemption is going to have something to do with letting God into our stories and cooperating with God in this healing process and coming to understand some things about ourselves and our stories that will help us understand how we became the person we became and why we struggle with the things that we struggle with. And again, guys, I would just advocate that this relates directly to the theme of this podcast, which basically has to do with sex, right? Sexual purity, the intersection of these three forces, me and sex and God. There's a collision right there, these three topics, Tony and sex and God. And I'm trying to figure out how I can be a healthier man sexually. I'm trying to figure out how I can learn to control sex instead of being controlled by sex. I want to learn to honor God with my sexual gift and honor my wife with my sexual gift. So if you're a man that's been struggling with these things, I'm advocating, guys, that if you're going to become a healthier man sexually, it's going to have something to do with you doing some work around the stories of your life, you coming to understand the stories of your life. And this is going to involve you taking a journey with God into the stories of your life so you can begin to see and understand some things about yourself that maybe you've never really seen or understood before. So I have 16 principles that I'm sharing in this series of episodes, Understanding Your Story, and we've already covered the first 5 principles, which is this. Principle 1, every person's life is made up of many different stories. Principle 2, stories hold power in people's hearts and lives. Principle 3, stories hold a variety of negative and destructive powers within them. Principle 4, the negative and destructive power that lives in people's stories is like poison in their soul. And Principle 5, some stories in people's lives hold more power than other stories. And with that being said, you guys, it brings us to Principle 6 of Understanding Your Story, which is this: stories follow people through their lives. And I would advocate that it's a serious mistake to think that because something happened in a person's life, let's say 30 years ago, or 27 years ago, or 19 years ago, or 10 years ago, that means that event, along with its corresponding implications and ramifications and consequences in their life, that they're somehow minimized or neutralized or irrelevant in their present-day life and reality. You see, someone might object by saying, but after all that, Tony, that was 10 years ago. That happened 19 years ago. So doesn't that mean that event or that situation or that story from this person's life, it's not really relevant anymore? It doesn't have any power or influence or consequence in their present-day reality, who they are today, because after all, that happened 19 years ago. Or said another way, that was then, and this is now. But unfortunately, nothing could be further from the truth, because the reality is that the stories of people's lives are like shadows, and they actually follow people through their life. And as you know, no matter how hard you try, no matter how fast you run, in the attempt to escape your own shadow, it just keeps following you, and it's impossible to get away from it. So no, it isn't true that just because something happened to a person in the past, maybe 19 years ago, that means that thing is somehow gone, or it's somehow neutralized or irrelevant, and that it lives only in their past, and it's not still implicating who they are today in their present life. And yes, it is true that stories follow people through their lives. And even though a story happened in a person's life maybe a very long time ago, it can still hold tremendous power and authority and influence in their present-day life and reality. And although I could offer so many more examples, I'm going to offer 3 quick examples to illustrate the reality of this principle, that stories follow people through their lives. And the first 2 examples I've already mentioned, but I'll mention them again because they're very close to home for me, and that's the examples of my wife and I. Concerning my wife, Sherry, she was raped when she was 13 years old, and without question, that event from her life began to follow her like a shadow into her life and into her future choices and decisions, into her self-image, into the way that she would allow guys to treat her, into her understandings of her own femininity and sexuality, into her understanding of who men are and what men want, into her understanding of what relationship is and what relationship's based upon, and into what's expected of her in her relationships with men, and so forth and so on. And then that event that happened to her when she was 13 years old followed her like a shadow 9 years later when she was 22 years old into her marriage with this guy named Tony Ingrassia. And without a doubt, Sherry's rape that had happened 9 years earlier in her life was still holding unbelievable, tremendous, poisonous, and toxic power in her heart and her life and soul, because even though her rape had happened chronologically in time 9 years earlier, it was still holding this toxic power in her present-day life and reality, even in the context of her relationship with her own husband. Because the fact is that Sherry did not yet understand the story of her own life, and she had not yet faced or processed or dealt with any of the corresponding issues and implications of that event in her life in a healing, therapeutic, or redemptive way. So we see from Sherry's example that it's true. Stories have a way of following people through their life. And then we come to my situation, and I have no doubt that the discovery of my father's stash of pornography and XXX books deeply and profoundly harmed my life, and that this event then began to follow me through my life and powerfully affected my life in negative and destructive and harmful ways for years and years to come. And the reason for this, at least in part, is because my discovery and subsequent involvement with said pornography laid the very foundation and groundwork and orientation and direction and understanding and trajectory within my heart and life of what sex was and how sex is supposed to be used and experienced in life. You see, this pornography embedded within me my earliest lessons and understandings of sex that would create the very framework of my sexuality and profoundly influence my way of thinking about sex and my way of experiencing sex literally for years to come. The pornography taught me, and it illustrated to me many deep and profound lessons that I didn't even understand that were being taught to me and embedded within me at the time that I was learning them. Lessons such as what sex was, and how a man should think about sex, and how a man should think about women, and what a man should want women to do during sex, and how a man should talk to women about sex, and how a man is supposed to treat a woman while he's having sex with her, and lessons about what was right and what was wrong about the way you express and experience your sexual gift, such as it's not wrong to have sex with all kinds of different people, because that's what the people in the pornography do. That's how you have sex, right? And faithfulness and fidelity or monogamy isn't important or expected when it comes to sex, because the people in the pornography, they don't do that. And that it's okay to do whatever you want to do when it comes to sex, as long as nobody knows you're doing it and as long as you don't get caught. And it's not really that bad to commit adultery or to use prostitutes or to watch other people have sex. And it's not that bad to express your sexual gift apart from your spouse, and that a man should not be expected to limit the expression of a sexual gift to one person only, just his wife. Are you kidding me? That's not what the people in the pornography do. And lessons like this, that women are primarily sexual objects to be used and exploited rather than a person that should be loved and respected, or that sex isn't primarily about love and relationship and intimacy, but it's more about lust and lasciviousness and selfishness, and on it goes. So as you can see, can you imagine how profoundly pornography begins to impact and influence and shape a young boy's understanding of sex and women and relationship, and how those lessons that he's learning from pornography are becoming embedded in him at such a young age, and then they begin to follow him into his life and into his experiences and into his choices and into his decisions and into his relationships and the way he's treating women and the way he's looking at women, the way he's talking to women. So these lessons are following him into his life, no doubt for years and years to come. And by the way, let me just throw something in here for free, you guys. For those of you who have daughters and granddaughters, which I do, by the way, I think we should be highly concerned about the reality of this porn-inundated and saturated society in which we're living, because I can pretty much promise you that in this day and age, that the young men who come to pursue and date your daughters and granddaughters one day are going to be highly saturated and marinated and oriented and inundated with such high levels of exposure and consumption of pornography that they're going to have many of these various lessons and orientations and proclivities and passions and perversions of said pornography literally embedded within them. And it's these understandings and orientations of sexuality and of women that are going to be informing and motivating these young men in their desires and their actions and their choices and their movements and thinking. And that these are the very young men who are going to be pursuing and dating your daughters and your granddaughters. And therefore, if I were you, I'd do everything and anything I could possibly do to prepare and equip my daughters for the profound implications of dating and courting in such a porn-infiltrated and saturated culture. And with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and share my third example that I was thinking of to affirm this point, which is that stories have a way of following people through their lives. My first example was Sherry, how her rape literally followed her in her life. My second example was myself, Tony, and how the discovery of my father's pornography followed me through life. And my third example is the story of Jamie Van Valen. And if you haven't heard the story of Steve and Jamie Van Valen, then I encourage you to go back and listen to episodes 49, 50, and 51 of the Power of Purity podcast, because Steve and Jamie's story is an amazing story of God's ability to heal people and to heal marriages that are deeply broken in the sexual area of their lives. But for those of you who heard Jamie's story, you'll remember that her mother and father got separated and then divorced when she was just 8 years old. Her father was then living with several other guys at kind of this bachelor's pad, and they had a ton of pornography all over the place and made no attempt whatsoever to hide the pornography from the children when they were visiting. And this young girl, Jamie, only 8 and then 9 and then 10 years old, would come over her father's house and watch these men and watch her father, and she could intuitively see how much these men, including her father, liked the women who were in the pornography. And she intuitively knew that her mother was nothing like the women in the pornography. So without even understanding what was happening to her, a message/conviction was becoming deeply embedded in this young girl's heart and life. I need to be like the women in the pornography. And I shouldn't be like my mom, because that's what men really want. That's what men really like. And that's why my dad left my mom, because she's not like that. So I need to be like the women in the magazines that my dad likes so much, because then men will love me, and men will want me, and men will like me, and men won't leave me. And so what happens next? These early stories and lessons begin to follow Jamie into her life, because as we're learning, stories have a way of following people into their lives. So Jamie, without really understanding how or why it's happening, becomes a very overtly sexualized young woman, and like a long line of dominoes, this reality begins to lead from one story of her life to the next story, to the next story, to the next story, to the next story, to the next experience, to the next experience, to the next, and so forth and so on, for literally years to come into Jamie's life and story. So the bottom line, you guys, is this. It's really true. Stories have a way of following people through their lives. And I've said this before, and I really believe it's true. If you want to understand who a person is, if you want to understand why a person's life has gone the way it's gone, if you want to understand why a person's made the decisions they've made, and why a person is the way that they are, then understand the stories of their life. Because every person is the sum total of the accumulation of the stories of their life. And the stories of a person's life have a way of following them through their life. And therefore, if you begin to understand a person's stories, you'll begin to understand that person better than you've ever understood them before. Do you want to know why a man is so incapable of connecting with his wife on an emotional level? Understand the stories of his life. Do you want to know why that young woman is so overtly sexualized and dresses so seductively? Why does she do that? Understand the stories of her life. Do you want to know why that woman ended up incarcerated at the women's prison in Vandalia, Missouri? Understand the stories of her life. Do you want to know why that Christian man has struggled so deeply with pornography and acting out sexually? Understand the stories of his life. Because the stories of that person's life explain who that person is. And how they become the person they've become will virtually always be explained by their stories. And with that being said, we'll move on to our next principle. And let me just say, guys, that I think that this next principle is incredibly important. And I think maybe it might help you to begin to understand yourself better than you ever have before. And it's this, Principle 7, stories layer themselves in people's lives and create life themes. And I'll say it one more time. Principle 7, stories layer themselves in people's lives and create life themes. Wow. This is an incredibly important principle to understand and comprehend. So let me share with you just a couple simple metaphors that will kind of introduce us and help us begin to understand this concept. And the first one is a metaphor of making lasagna. Don't you just love a good lasagna? I love it. But the way you make lasagna is to create layers, right? So they lay down a layer of noodles, and then on top of that, they put a layer of sauce, and then a layer of ricotta cheese, and then a layer of other types of cheeses, and then another layer of noodles, and then another layer of sauce, and then another layer of ricotta cheese, and then another layer of other cheeses, and so forth and so on, until the pan is filled up all the way to the top of the pan with all these various layers, and you end up with this delicious lasagna because that's what all those layers have created. Or what about the metaphor of the groove, which I think I've shared somewhere in the history of the podcast? But if I took an ice pick or a knife or any other sharp object, and I literally purposely scratched the top of an oak table, and I made a long scratch, let's say about 2 feet long, and toward the end I turned the scratch to the left, it probably at first would make just the slightest little scratch on top of the table. But then what if I went back, guys, and I followed the very same scratch with my ice pick or my knife, and I followed the line all the way down about 2 feet, and then again, I turn left, and then what if I did this over and over and over and over again, not dozens of times and not even hundreds of times, but what if I did this thousands and thousands of times, following the same line over and over and over again? You see, in a short matter of time, I would no doubt establish a groove. And the more I follow that groove, the deeper the groove would get, and pretty soon I wouldn't even have to think about turning to the left, because the momentum of my scratch, the forward movement, and the established groove would automatically direct the forward movement of the scratch, and I'd go to the left. And the groove would therefore become deeper and deeper and literally become embedded in the oak tabletop, and I would then automatically follow the same groove over and over again. And in a very real way, I'd advocate that this is exactly what happens in many of our lives. As similar events and situations and experiences and stories begin to layer themselves upon our lives, and those similar stories repeated over and over again, then begin to cut and establish a kind of groove in our soul and our life. And therefore, before we know it, something is literally becoming imprinted or embedded within us, like the groove on the top of the table, and then we almost automatically begin to follow that established groove over and over again. So what do? We put ourselves in similar situations, or we seek out relationships with similar kinds of people, or we make familiar choices and decisions because that's what we've become accustomed to, or we allow people to treat us or speak to us in a certain way, the same way over and over again, or we reach out to the same coping mechanisms and strategies in our attempt to manage the confusion, disorientation, or pain of our lives. And we continue to do so even when we intuitively know and sense that our chosen path is unhealthy for our lives, if not destructive, and yet we go on and on and on in this way, following the groove that's already been established and that's becoming more deeply embedded in our lives all the time. And then, as we follow this same pattern and groove over and over again, making similar choices and decisions and going to familiar places and hanging around with the same kinds of people, we might say that a kind of theme begins to emerge in a person's life that in a sense begins to define who they are and where they're going in their life, the trajectory of their life. And it might be a theme around alcohol, or a theme of drugs, or a theme of abusive men in relationships, or a theme of abusing food, or a theme of running away when the going gets tough, or a theme of shutting down and withdrawing in my relationships, or a theme of manipulating others, or a theme of hiding and avoiding, or in the shadow of the primary purpose of this podcast, a theme of pornography, a theme of sexualization, a theme of licentiousness, a theme of orgasm, which I happen to believe, by the way, becomes a primary and defining theme in the heart and lives of many men, if not most men, including Christian men. And the fact is that we can see this concept of layers and themes over and over again in so many people's lives and situations. For example, in the illustration I shared previously of Jenny from the movie Forrest Gump, we can see many different layers of hurt and pain and story being laid on top of her life, one after the other, over and over again. We see her being sexually abused by her father when she's a little girl, and we see her praying to God to turn her into a little bird so she can fly far, far away. And we see her going to live with her grandma when DFS takes her away from her father. And we see her hanging out with a bunch of hippies as she learns to experiment with alcohol and then drugs and sex. And we see her running away with complete strangers, and we see her giving herself away sexually. We see her becoming involved with the Black Panthers. We see her moving on to harder drugs like cocaine and heroin. And then in a dramatic scene, we see her climb up on a balcony when she's completely wasted on drugs, and she's tempted to answer her own prayer when she was a little girl and jump off the balcony so she can fly far, far away. So isn't it interesting to notice the layers of stories in Jenny's life and how the combined influence of those layered stories begin to work together and follow her through life and determine the trajectory and the flavor and orientation of her life. And in the way of another example, my wife and I were going to this Bible study group one time, and as we got to know this particular one woman, it became pretty obvious that she had many stories layered in her life that accumulated together to create a theme of rejection for her. When she was a young girl, her father abandoned the family, which she experienced, of course, as a profound rejection. Then she was part of a tight group of girls at school. They were all friends, and through a series of events, she became ostracized from the group, which, of course, she experienced as a profound rejection. Then later, her and her best friend had a misunderstanding, and her best friend would no longer speak to her, which, of course, she experienced as a profound rejection. Then she went through a series of boyfriends, and virtually every one of her boyfriends would end up breaking up with her and leaving her for another girl, which she experienced as more rejection. And then she eventually became engaged, and her fiancé broke up with her as they were planning the wedding, which, of course, she experienced as a profound rejection. And then she eventually married, and she eventually caught her husband looking at internet pornography, not just one time, but many different times. And he would promise her, "I'm sorry, honey, I'll never do it again. I promise I'll never." And then she'd catch him again and again. And of course, every time she caught her husband looking at pornography, she experienced it as a profound rejection because she wasn't good enough. And as we got to know this woman and know more of her story, we saw that she had this deep and ongoing struggle with fear and insecurity, not only in her relationship with her husband, but also in her relationship with God, because it was very hard for her to feel close to God. She felt that no matter what she did, she wasn't good enough for God. She felt that she was continuously disappointing God and that God was disappointed in her. And she got to the place where she was literally questioning her salvation because she didn't know for sure that God really loved her. She didn't know for sure that God would really take her to heaven when she died. But guys, can you see how the stories of this woman's life were strategically layered over the years, one after the other, after the other, after the other, in such a way that a very real theme of fear and insecurity and rejection eventually emerged in her heart and soul. You know why? Because if you scratch the table and go to the left, and scratch the table and go to the left over and over and over and over again, pretty soon a groove's going to get cut into that table, and then a person just going to follow that groove. So why wouldn't she be insecure in her relationship with God? Why wouldn't she be insecure in her relationship with her husband? Why wouldn't she expect her husband to leave her? Why wouldn't she expect God to leave her? Because That's what's happened to her over and over and over again in her life. Virtually every key relationship of her life, she was abandoned over and over again. And with that being said, you guys, I see from the clock that I'm out of time today, and I normally don't do this, but we are in the middle of principle number 7. Stories layer themselves in people's lives and create life themes. But I still have quite a bit more that I want to say about this particular principle. So I'm going to go ahead and finish up this episode today. And if you're interested in this, and you're interested in hearing the conclusion of Principle 7 as we move forward, then you are very welcome to come back and be with me next week. In our next episode, we are going to continue this series of episodes, Understanding Your Story, and we'll continue Principle 7, Stories layer themselves in people's lives and create life themes. So thanks for listening in today, you guys. God bless you, and have an awesome day.
Thanks for listening. Visit powerofpurity.org for more resources and information. And if this podcast has been helpful or encouraging, please invite a friend to listen. Until next time, remember, there's power in purity.